risk, again, was that risk that ISACA wants you to know for your exam. Controls are used to reduce residual risk. We already knew that. Residual risk, again, was that risk that was beyond our risk appetite, beyond our risk acceptance. We need to use controls to reduce that risk back to within tolerance, back to within acceptance. So, unjustified controls typically reduce return on investment. How bizarre is this? We know that we justify controls because they bring positive return on investment. So I guess ISACA decided, well, if that's true, they could make a mirror of that question and say that means that unjustified controls reduce ROI. It's the opposite. That's true. Okay. At least it's consistent with the other question. Controls should be selected based on their ability to reduce business risk, but again, at acceptable cost. What is an acceptable cost? A cost that's less than what the risk would be without the control. That's what it is. That's return on investment, right? So we now look at, again, control implementation. Once a new control has been implemented to mitigate a previously identified risk, well, then we have to test the control to see if it actually accomplished goal. Calculating the benefits realized from the implementation of that control can be difficult because sometimes benefits are both tangible as well as intangible. So, practice question, what should be performed immediately after changes to ICT infrastructure? Yeah, if you didn't see this on the slide, this is just to kind of twist it up and challenge you a bit. What do we need to perform immediately after changes to ICT infrastructure? Approval for the ICT changes should be obtained and recorded. The ICT changes should be reported to designated systems owners. The changes should be tested for functionality, or should we simply perform a penetration test? What do you think? Okay, let's go ahead and find out how we did on this one. Changes to the ICT infrastructure. The changes should be tested for functionality is what most people chose. That's because they're thinking about it from an IT manager's perspective. However, this is, again, a risk management exam. They're not talking about changes to the controls themselves. They're talking about changes to the system. And you may remember, we're concerned that any changes to the system may have introduced new vulnerabilities. And if it potentially introduced new vulnerabilities, we need to check that and test for it with a penetration test, which tests for vulnerabilities. That is the correct answer, is penetration tests. So we move on, control testing. By the way, if you say, I still don't really agree with this one, that's okay. Just memorize it for your exam. It'll be in your practice questions. So, by the way, I saw a lot of folks signed up for the practice questions yesterday. Good job there. Again, the cost is right. May as well do it. Why not? Control testing and effectiveness evaluation. Now, again, control testing is actually also covered in depth, much more in depth, in information security in the next domain in the systems development lifecycle topic. So we're going to kind of skate through it a little bit here. We'll cover it more in depth there because there's just no sense in covering it in depth twice. Control testing and effectiveness evaluation, just best practices to memorize for the exam. How well the control works. If it accomplishes goal, the control objective, it's verified by testing its ability to achieve that control, and that the control is tested to see if it achieves its control objective, and then we would know it was effective. Information systems controls, again, are regularly tested to identify any potential design flaws, failures, redundancies, but that's where we find out whether or not the control doesn't work and why. Performing periodic penetration testing helps us ensure that a corporate network is still adequately secured against external attack, because that's the type of vulnerability assessment. Again, control testing is what helps us determine the effectiveness of controls. We already get that. We already talked about it. This is just a little different way of saying it. Vulnerability scans, like a penetration test, are more practical, they say, than penetration testing. But wait a minute. Earlier they said penetration testing is testing for vulnerabilities. Welcome to ISACA's testing world. For those of you that felt like you ran into contradictions before, but you thought maybe you were crazy, you weren't. Ladies and gentlemen, these two starred points are both potentially on the same exam. So going back, by the way, don't get mad at me. Again, I don't like teaching it that way either, but if it helps you pass the test, that's what this course is about. It's not about being right, it's about being CRISC certified. So, control effectiveness is verified by what? Okay, let's see how we did. Testing its ability to achieve its control objective. All of these answers sound wonderful, they do. But ISACA feels, again, the best way to attest the effectiveness of a control is to see if it actually accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish. And you could say, Alan, that's just a different way of testing its ability to function as designed. Well, functioning as designed is one thing. Was the design good enough to actually achieve objective is a different thing. So, again, a control could be functioning as designed, but the control, even functioning as designed, wasn't sufficient to really reduce the risk enough. So it's really measured against its control objective, and that is the correct answer. So we now go on into, again, another section. This particular domain, again, normally these CRISC exam domains only have 2 sections. This particular domain has 3. And we are now going into section 3, risk monitoring and reporting. We will look at risk treatment plans. We'll continue on with data collection, aggregation, analysis, and validation. And by the way, just so you know, we're going to, once we finish this particular domain, we're then going to be taking our first break, where I will endeavor to get my video back. Not endeavor, I will get our video back. That's what we teach our children, right? Don't try, you will, you shall. Moving on, we're going to not only talk about risk treatment plans, we will talk about data collection, aggregation, analysis, and validation. We will talk about risk and control monitoring techniques. We'll continue with risk and control reporting techniques, such as heat maps, scorecards, and dashboards. We'll talk about key performance indicators, KPIs, and we'll talk then about key risk indicators, or KRIs. And then finally, we have another one. We'll talk about key control indicators as well, KCIs. We'll talk about the relation between the 3. That's actually a pretty interesting discussion. So, risk treatment plans, let's get into that. Remember, risk treatment plans, we might have more than one incident response procedure collected in an overall treatment plan. So that means risk treatment plans cover all the risk identified in the risk register that exceeds enterprise risk tolerance or risk appetite, and therefore needs treatment. So our risk mitigation or treatment plan is then used to reduce or remediate a risk. The risk treatment plan, again, provides this framework that documents the priority in which individual risk actions should be implemented. Again, how will you see this on the exam? Which of the following provides a framework documenting priority for individual actions to be implemented and how they should be implemented, you would select the proper answer being the risk treatment plan. The risk treatment plans are necessary to describe how the chosen treatment options will be implemented. That just is another way of rephrasing the first bullet point. Again, this risk mitigation activity is typically associated with incident response. Interesting. So now that we're down into risk treatment and risk reduction, now they're saying that this is really dealing with incident response rather than incident prevention. You know what? I've got a problem with that myself. Don't worry about it. If you see a question phrased in this way, the answer you need to know. Risk mitigation is an activity typically associated with what? Incident prevention, risk prevention, risk mitigation, incident response. Don't argue with them. Choose the one they like. They like incident response. Then you and I can know better later. Incident response plans indicate the preparedness of the enterprise to handle unexpected events. By the way, again, I may have some folks in the audience today that didn't hear me explain yesterday at the start that so much of this material that comes from ISACA, again, tends to be very arguable with real-world understanding and best practice. And it isn't that I don't know that real-world best practice, just like you know it, but sometimes you have to kind of let that go in order to pass their questions, which is a very long way of saying their exam isn't always very accurate to real life. But if you want to be CRISC certified, you just take that and go with it for a day. And you get your certification, and we'll all be happy. So again, I just wanted to bring that out there because what makes this exam so difficult is when I have smart people taking it and they know better. And that smartness, it works against them every time. Do it ISACA's way on exam day. Just stay there. Incident response plans indicate the preparedness of the enterprise to handle unexpected events. Your treatment plan should be defined, clearly identifying priority. We've already talked about that as well. Incident response procedures and controls are prioritized. We've talked about that. And they're prioritized according to what? Criticality determined by a business impact analysis. So, how far back do you need to remember to answer this question? Incident response procedures and controls are prioritized for implementation according to criticality determined in a, what was it? It was just in the previous slide. Don't cheat and go look on your PDF. That's no fun. And what did we end up with? Business impact analysis. Risk assessment. Yeah, I know it sounds good, but that isn't what was said on the previous slide. Come on. Remember, I said, remember it the way that ISACA wants to see it, and this is the way that they want to see it. By the way, remember, risk is measured in impact. And so if we're going to prioritize, we'll prioritize according to that impact. And we determine that impact in a business impact analysis. So that's why that would be the correct answer for ISACA. So we move on. Data collection, aggregation, analysis, and validation. So again, remember that when we perform IT risk assessments, monitoring risk on an ongoing basis, we're collecting a lot of information. And that information, therefore, must be collected, stored, and made available in a ready way for ongoing analysis and monitoring. So that means we have to design and implement this to ensure integrity, accuracy, timeliness, and availability. For your exam, remember that this is where they introduce something relatively recent in coming about, the Security Information and Event Management System, the SIEM system. Folks, you'll be seeing this come up on other exams like CRISC and the like, or not CRISC, but rather CISSP. So it's on this exam. It's on CISSP exam. I don't think I remembered on the CISM yet. Who was it? SG out there? You just took your CISSP, or rather your CISM exam, I think. Did you see a SEAM question on it? If so, let us know. The event management system, again, has this capability then to merge logs from different systems so it can analyze the entire data sets at once. It aggregates all of that logging so you can get the good forest view of it. It's an excellent source of information for investigating the root cause of a security incident. That is actually quite true, and that might be on your test. So we move on into risk and control monitoring techniques. Again, using this diagram, this flow chart that's so handy from ISO 27005, they explain that risk monitoring or review, that's really something that, again, once you've determined a risk treatment and you've tested it to see if it actually works to reduce your risk as you need it to, remember the risk changes. And if the risk changes, then that means the control might not be good enough at a later date. So we have to monitor that risk and make sure that we're still aligned. All risk information obtained from risk management activities is continuously monitored, reviewed, improved as necessary. Again, we got to make sure that our understanding of risk context, the environment, could be compliance requirements changed, therefore the control isn't good enough anymore. We have to go back and reassess according to current day requirements. Continuous monitoring then is used to detect changes in the enterprise's risk environment. Again, how will this be asked? Which of the following is used to detect changes in the enterprise's risk environment? You would choose continuous monitoring. What determines the capacity and readiness of an entity to develop its risk management program? Why, that would be that capability assessment, likely against the capability maturity model with its 5 levels, you may remember. That's what we talked about yesterday, evaluating the effectiveness of the program. Again, what is the first step when developing a risk monitoring program? They say measure and monitor the risk program itself to see if it's still good. Conduct a capability assessment against your very own program in terms of your very first monitoring step. So again, what are performed to capture changes to the threat and vulnerability profile? Those would be periodic risk assessments. What should trigger an evaluation of how changes in business operations and cultures could affect the risk assessment? Why, again, that would be significant changes such as a merger or acquisition would do it. That would trigger that evaluation again. So what are the 4 steps, according to ISACA, of risk monitoring and reporting? They have specific ideas on this. You're going to need to know the sequence in which these are applied, and you'll need to know them in this way. First off, when you're developing, implementing continuous monitoring, testing of controls, you plan the scope of your monitoring program by identifying high-risk, critical business processes. Those are areas that have high inherent risk, you may remember from yesterday. Second thing is you'll say, well, I have controls in place, because remember, this is a controls monitoring program. I have controls in place, so the very first thing I need to do is, hey, I've got control objectives that we're supposed to be able to hit. Do these controls accomplish their related control objectives? Ladies and gentlemen, most organizations aren't mature enough to really even have narratives showing control objectives for their controls. Meaning I, as an auditor, come in, I'm supposed to be testing the controls against those control objectives, and they don't even have control objectives. I'm supposed to just go in there and rate them on a 0 to 5 according to my best guess. That means the program itself was poor to begin with, if they didn't already have control objectives that drove their controls. But I digress. So moving on to this other point, what do we use to monitor the control lifecycle? That requires thresholds to identify when controls are no longer providing their value. We use metrics. That's what we use. That's your exam answer. So, what is used to identify controls not operating within acceptable tolerances for risk and performance? Well, we would analyze compliance test results. If I have any CISSPs out there, you understand or not CISSPs, rather CISAs, Certified Information Systems Auditor by ISACA. When you prepare for that, you find out testing a control to see if it actually works and achieves control objectives is called compliance testing. And that's how it creeped over into this exam. We analyze compliance test results, which are testing whether the controls worked or not, to determine, identify controls that are not operating within acceptable tolerances, meaning they're not achieving their control objectives. In the fourth and final step of risk monitoring reporting is where we finally report our findings to senior management. Control testing and validation. If a security exception has been identified, again, before you run to fix anything or even report it, we first validate the security concern or exception before we do anything else. So in other words, once you've identified a potential problem, you need to validate whether the problem is real before you actually act on it. That is true through another couple of questions as well. You'll see that in Domain 4. Testing of critical systems should always be performed outside of normal business hours during maintenance windows, so that way you don't disrupt the business itself with your own testing. So, practice question to see if you were listening, see if you fell asleep while I was talking. If a security exception has been identified, which of the following choices is the appropriate response? Initially, once you've identified a problem, what do? Implement an appropriate corrective action to fix that problem, mitigate the exception. You contain the exception, you validate the exception, or you report it to senior management. Which do you do first? You're going to do all of those things, but which one should you do first?